Kruse. I'm graduating this year. I am an English major and a women and gender studies major, and I'm also in the honors program. The project that I'm working on is, it works for me in many ways. It's my McNair research as well as my senior honors thesis, as well as it counts towards my degree in women and gender studies. So I got lucky in that way. My chair for my thesis and my research mentor is Dr. Nikki Bergeron in the English department. I'm getting confused. History department and women and gender studies department as well. We'll see how I am on time. You should. In the late 20th century, civil rights activists, women liberation, anti-war movements, rights for gender and sexual minorities, workers, and other activists in the New Left challenged social and political structures. After the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which disallowed labor discrimination based on sex, feminists began asking for more representation within the law. In February of 1970, a national organization of women rally pushed the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, into the attention of Congress. With a constant flow of letters and telegrams to reluctant congressmen, the petition reached the necessary 218 signatures on July 20th and thus bypassed a committee vote. And on August 10th, it passed the House 350 to 15. The amendment cycled through a number of drafts since its beginnings right after the suffrage movement came to a close. In the language of the amendment that activists were working on in the 70s is on the screen here. It reads, it's in 3 sections. The equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. The Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article, and the amendment shall take effect 2 years after the date of ratification. So this would have been an amendment to the Constitution. Many scholars characterize this period of women's activism as a new era of the feminist movement. While women appealed to political structures for centuries, the increase in direct testimony and communication with official political channels is noteworthy. This research focuses on organizations that demonstrate concern on a broad range of issues. While it's easy to place blame in the ultimate failure of the Equal Rights Amendment within the women's movement, in reality, each state failed to ratify the amendment for unique local and cultural reasons, which necessitates the need for research such as this, which is a focus specifically on North Dakota. How did feminist activists organize in North Dakota, a primarily rural state? How were their methods similar or different to groups working on a national scale? This thesis asserts such questions to ultimately argue that North Dakotan activists for the ERA found it most effective to influence legislators by working within channels of political structures, traditional channels of political structures. Activists, North Dakotan or otherwise, could choose whether to protest and disrupt or to follow the established procedures of political influence. Organizations working for the ERA trained members to be respectful and effective when lobbying legislators in a way that would appeal to the North Dakotan political environment. This shows that activists were successful by appealing to a calm and calculated method rather than disrupting and protesting that may have been successful in other moments of the women's liberation movement. My methodology includes primary documents that were all found and housed in the Ellen B. Robinson Special Collections within the Chester Fritz Library at the University of North Dakota. My experiences in the present day North Dakota drove me to seek out the differences between rural and urban activism during a time of historical significance such as the 60s and 70s. Focusing on the collections from local chapters of national organizations allowed me to see how North Dakota fits into the narrative of nationwide activism. The ERA specifically allowed for a directed national issue that depended greatly on statewide organizing efforts. It would have been interesting to compare multiple organizations like the National Organization of Women and the League of Women Voters. It ended up changing a little bit in the end. I wanted to see how these organizations handled their endeavors to comment on the nature of state chapters of national organizations and their relationship with the historical narratives. And then the Coordinating Council for the Equal Rights Amendment, which I'll refer to as SARA, what is a fulsome collection in the special collections that shifted the scope of my project when I found the perspective that it offered me. The SARA records are made of 5 boxes, 4 linear feet on the shelf. To approach this collection, I turned my eye towards interorganizational communications. This normally took the form of newsletters. I also looked at meeting minutes to get a sense of organizational structure within the group. The NOW records were not as useful for specific correspondence regarding the ERA, but contained insight to local chapters and other issues important to the organization. And then I mostly used, my other primary source was the League of Women Voters records that are specifically from Minot. Even though they are only from one area, they gave me a piece of the local organizing efforts that are apparent, as well as communication with the state and national chapters from Minot. I placed myself in conversation with other scholars who study the ERA by state analysis. Scholars Critchlow and Stachecki survey some of what other ERA scholars have observed. Scholars argued that by relying on centralized organizations based in Washington, D.C., ERA proponents failed to organize their supporters at the grassroots. It's interesting that this issue even arose considering the right out the gates speed that the ERA ratification originally had. Before 1973, 30 states had already ratified, and that left the next 9 years open to a contentious debate on women's rights, constitutional authority, and the meaning of equality. Next, significantly, Sewell and Olzak argue that for the integration of policy understanding at the state level and national level, the authors push back against what they consider to be a popular stance of scholars of American history and politics that the ERA was a failure of policy. Instead, these authors claim that the ERA could be seen as an example of successful policy outcome at the state level in those states that ratified. Critchlow and Stachecki even use Sewell and Olzak in their work, and Sewell and Olzak take the stance that the history of the ERA ratification at the state level is extremely useful for exploring theories about the relationship between social movements and policy outcomes. Then that moves us to the opposition to the ERA. To give a brief picture of the kinds of opposition ERA activists face, I'll focus mostly today on Phyllis Schlafly as a representation of the larger movement. She was one of the largest antagonists to the women's liberation movement throughout her career and late into her life. She and her colleagues campaigned with large budgets, completing speaking tours, television interviews, and print publications. Lynn Ford characterizes her movement as such. Schlafly denounced careers for married women, and critics of Schlafly are quick to point out that Schlafly did in fact build a very busy career for herself. Schlafly's camp deeply rooted their case in God's plan for human survival. There is, of course, great irony in Schlafly's position. She spent much of the campaign traveling across the country away from her young family. Often she would begin a speaking engagement by thanking her husband for letting her travel with the sole purpose to goad feminists. Schlafly enjoyed a great privilege of her work coming from the white upper middle class with post-bachelorette degrees. And because of this reality, the conversation around working women at this time from her camp lacks diverse perspectives. Women belonging to racial minorities did not always enjoy the choice to work outside the home when it was often necessary to provide for their families. The social aspects of the ERA debate frequently focused on ideals of femininity, and this complicates any conversation of race and gender before they even start. Activists in North Dakota had to consider Schlafly's nationwide opposition as well as their own unique localized challenges. And that brings me to my state. For the League of Women Voters, they've always been nonpartisan but are progressive in nature. When we look at ERA activists from the League or from SARA, the emphasis on nonpartisan affiliation will persist. On nonpartisan and political policy, the League sees that they are most effective as a nonpartisan organization. The League newsletters demonstrate their tendency to follow a traditional reactionary technique. Members were encouraged to form calculated responses to opposing forces by communicating through established channels. One moment to display work from the League comes from January of 1973. A newsletter to members offered on information on the Equal Rights Amendment. This letter calls to members in Minot who are attuned to the argument in the communities against the amendment, and this is from the newsletter. The ERA needs our support. If you have been listening to the talk shows in Minot, you are well aware of the opposition to the ERA. Informed persons know the hysterical arguments against the ratification of the ERA simply are not supported by fact. We need to see that our information reaches as many people as possible. This newsletter encourages members not only to challenge misinformed views in the community, but also to write to their representatives. With the following caveat, that it is not necessary that we write more than 2 or 3 lines. The important thing is that we write. They are already hearing from the opposition, and they need to hear from us as well. League members must write as individual citizens rather than as league members at this point, because the national organization had not yet officially publicized its support. So it was interesting for those activists to have to work with that dynamic. And then to get to Sarah, this group had the most extensive effort for the ERA in North Dakota. Not only are their records great, but because of their wide reach across the state, their records are also the most revealing. Some of the most extensive work Sarah underwent was a poll of all legislators and legislative candidates in North Dakota. Members kept extensive track of every sitting legislator's position on the ERA to anticipate the results and the focus of their efforts. Their strategies included providing members with tips on public relations, phone networking, letter writing, and even working with men and the Equal Rights Amendment. Sarah kept close track of legislators' positions on the amendment as part of their approach. Chalamonjic, the president of Sarah, wrote to members, "Keep our yes votes yes, forget the solid no votes, and work those in between." This direction sounds easy enough, but the letter continues to give detailed advice on the in-betweens. Those who tell Sarah members that they are not yet decided, according to Chalamonjic, will watch the political atmosphere and go the way the wind blows. Chalamonjic encourages members to keep the ladylike image, our low-key but solid support, respectable information, responsible lobbying, etc., etc. Sarah's close account of who's voting yes or no continued until moments before the final vote. While we have not looked at every communication with the legislators, we can tell that Sarah members forged relationships with them over the years leading up to the vote. Not only did Sarah want to know the position of each legislator, but they also wanted a source in the Capitol that would tell them which way the winds might change. Following the drama of ratification today, Chalamonjic needed to address final business for Sarah. She asked members if the organization should self-destruct, as it was originally intended, or continue to work in the region as an organizing force. She calls a final meeting and celebration to decide. She asks that members return all of their ERA correspondence. Copy what you want in your own files, and I would like to put everything together and submit to UND's Political History Library. And we're thankful that she did. The final section of the newsletter details the final funding picture, as well as a number of comments from others on the ERA ratification in North Dakota. Many are from leaders within the state, but others send support from across the country. In 2017, even 35 years after the final deadline, Nevada recently voted to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. As one would expect, even this action is not without its debate. Is it symbolic? Is it viable? What effect does it have on the Equal Rights Amendment's failures or other progressive activists? If Nevada took 35 years after the final deadline to ratify, what does that say about the incredible success of activists in North Dakota? If the situation was flipped, and we could speculate, could feminists depend on North Dakota lawmakers to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment so long after its time? The renewed interest in ERA, partnered with the visible reassurance of progressive activism, highlights the importance of the work like that of Sarah and the League of Women Voters. In Minot, the League of Women Voters were active in the community, but mostly as active political participants, not necessarily as women activists only for women's issues. They involve themselves in gendered and non-gendered activism. Concerns for flooding affects any residents, but specific concerns for education may be related to that of a mother or figure in society. Minot League of Women Voters tailored themselves to stay neutral. The League of Women Voters organization is a chapter of a state and national organization, and this limits the organic movement that they may have been possible in an area with more political momentum. Sarah activists led a targeted methodical campaign for their cause. They wanted North Dakotans to view the ERA favorably, of course, but at the end of the day, they wanted to make sure that their messaging was reaching legislators in Bismarck. Sarah's strategies included uniting both parties on the issue, making connections with legislators' wives, and community outreach. For members and volunteers who wanted to directly lobby legislators, Sarah gave clear instructions to maintain a respectful demeanor and always be polite. Their goal was never to agitate, but to work within the proper channels of communication of political representation. The Minot League of Women Voter and Sarah's responses to North Dakota's political climate worked in their favor, and in the end, they would enjoy the success of their state's ratification. Activists demonstrated their ability to strategize, lobby, and be active political agents. North Dakotan activists would make political structures work in their favor and train members to be effective in communicating with their lawmakers. My sources, and I would be happy to take questions if we have time. Do we have time?
Time, yeah.
Okay. Any questions?
I have a question for you. I agree with the one point you made about the mother that traveled. She had a young family. It's pretty ironic, the story. But I was just wondering your reaction to a modern-day stay-at-home mom. What would your reaction to that be?
I mean, I don't really have any sort of like literature to give you on that from my research.
Just your personal opinion.
My personal opinion, women are allowed to find fulfilling life choices, whatever they may choose to do.
What was the question?
If what my thought on stay-at-home moms are.
What's stay home dad?
People can do whatever they want. Yeah.
Sandy, do you think, I know you are active in the community, both in the local and the state level, do you think women's activism, feminist activism has changed since this period that you're talking about, or is it kind of follow the same strategy?
I think it does. I think that the North Dakota political climate also allows us to or necessitates that we maintain that respectful, responsible demeanor when we're challenging legislators, or even not even necessarily needing to challenge them, but interacting with them, especially because our other option, which I make the case that you either have the choice to be respectful or you have the choice to be aggravate. And it's hard to do that when it's cold. And it's hard to do that when the state is so big and it's so hard to get people to Bismarck. So I think that it's similar in the way that we have phone banking and we have letter writing campaigns, and if that makes sense.
Yeah, I just wonder if you find it frustrating, maybe I'm reading my own frustration,
Yeah.
but to protest and to agitate is your right, and it's not necessarily rude, and it seems
Sure.
very gendered.
Oh yeah.
It is depicted as being rude and aggravating when it's women who are doing it. So I just wondered if your sense is
We're really
feminist
good.
activists.
We're really good at being aggravating, and protesting in the streets. Yeah, definitely. I would echo that.
But also the other side is that the working through traditional means, it seems to work. I mean, I know I've maybe been struck more with you in this project of how did this pass in North Dakota? My gosh.
Yeah, the North, it's really tempting to just say oh, they had to be North Dakota, nice, but I obviously need to find the sources to back that up. But that was sort of what we anticipated, was that they needed to be polite and they needed to be good North Dakota wives and mothers who are looking out for the well-being of the state and the country, who wanted this amendment passed. So maybe
Well, that's a smart political calculation, right? It wasn't
Right.
that they gave in, they were being very smart. I'm glad you discovered that.
that's from one of the documents. We already, yes. So, if there's no more questions, thank you very much.
Thank you.